There is something about your connection that was never meant to be understood from the surface. 11 nights. That is how long someone has been lying awake with one sentence repeating inside their mind. Not a song. Not a conversation. Not a memory they can simply dismiss. One sentence. A sentence spoken by a psychic after being asked to reveal what truly remained inside their heart. The person asking did not expect anything extraordinary. They expected a few vague words. Maybe a prediction. Maybe some comforting explanation. Instead, the psychic looked at them for several seconds and became completely silent. Then came the words that changed the atmosphere in the room. Your problem is not that you cannot let this person go. Your problem is that you finally discovered what their presence revealed about you. Everything stopped. Your soulmate did not answer. They simply stared. Because somewhere beneath every excuse, every distraction, every attempt to move forward, they knew those words had touched something painfully accurate. And if you are hearing this right now, pay attention. Because the psychic did not reveal your name. They did not need to. Your soulmate already knew exactly who the message was about. The person they had been trying not to think about. The person whose absence somehow became louder than their presence. The person they told themselves they had forgotten. You. And before you make the mistake of thinking this is simply another story about someone missing you, listen carefully. This is much deeper than longing. This is about recognition. There are people who enter your life and leave behind memories. Then there are rare connections that leave behind questions. Why did I feel so safe around them? Why did I become so afraid when things became serious? Why did I pull away when everything inside me wanted to stay? Why did I hurt someone I never intended to lose? Why does another person's silence still affect me long after the conversation ended? Those questions had been following your soulmate for longer than you realize. They had become skilled at hiding them. During the day, everything appeared normal. Responsibilities continued. Messages were answered. Work demanded attention. People laughed around them. Life moved forward. But nighttime removed the distractions. That was when the memories returned. And there was one particular memory they could never completely bury. Perhaps you remember it too. Maybe it was the last meaningful conversation. Maybe it happened in a quiet place where neither of you understood that the moment would become important later. Maybe you said something simple. Something you barely remember saying. Yet those words remained inside them. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were honest. You spoke from a place that required no performance. You did not try to impress them. You did not demand anything. You simply revealed something genuine. And that sincerity frightened them more than they admitted. Because when someone sees through your defenses, you have two choices. You can become vulnerable. Or you can disappear. They disappeared. At least emotionally. Maybe physically too. And for a while, they convinced themselves that leaving was the strongest thing they could do. But distance does not automatically create peace. Sometimes distance only gives regret enough room to grow. This is where Archangel Michael's message enters this story. If these words are reaching you at the exact moment your heart feels unusually quiet, imagine this message as a reminder of protection rather than a command to chase anyone. You do not need to pursue what is meant to meet you with equal effort. You do not need to beg for clarity. You do not need to prove your worth. What belongs in your life must eventually be capable of standing in the light. And that is precisely what your soulmate has been struggling with. The psychic asked them a second question. When you think about this person, what hurts the most? They expected an answer about losing you. Instead, your soulmate said something completely different. I never gave them the version of me they deserved. That confession changed everything. Because regret is not always about losing another person. Sometimes regret comes from realizing that your own fear sabotaged something beautiful. Your soulmate began remembering moments they had misunderstood. Your patience. Your silence. Your attempts to understand them. The times you gave them another chance. The moments when you could have demanded answers but chose compassion instead. And then another realization arrived. You were never asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty. That distinction stayed with them. It made every excuse feel weaker. Every distraction became temporary. Every new conversation seemed unable to reach the place your connection had reached. This does not mean every soulmate connection automatically ends in reunion. Hear that clearly. Some connections arrive to awaken something. Some teach boundaries. Some expose wounds. Some show you what love should feel like. And some force two people to confront parts of themselves they would rather avoid. Your connection may have done more than one of these things. That is why trying to label it too quickly never worked. Your soulmate could not reduce you to an old relationship. They could not place you neatly into the category of past. Something remained unfinished. But the unfinished part was not necessarily a relationship. It was the truth. And the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. On the seventh night, they remembered something they had not thought about in months. On the eighth, another memory appeared. On the ninth, they searched for an old conversation. On the 10th, they almost reached out. Then came the 11th night. That night felt different. They were exhausted from fighting their own thoughts. So instead of pushing the memories away, they finally allowed them to come. One after another. The first meeting. The first moment of emotional closeness. The moment they realized they cared. The moment fear entered. The moment distance began. And finally, the moment they walked away. For the first time, they viewed the entire connection without defending themselves. No excuses. No blame. No rewriting history. Just truth. And the truth hurt. Because they realized something they had never wanted to admit. They had not walked away because you meant too little. They had walked away because you had begun to mean too much. That realization explains more than any prediction ever could. Some people become frightened when love feels uncertain. Others become frightened when love feels certain. Certainty demands courage. It asks you to stop hiding. It asks you to become accountable. It asks you to let another person see the parts of yourself you normally protect. Your soulmate was not prepared for that. So they chose distance. But distance could not erase recognition. The psychic watched them struggle with the realization. Then came the sentence that would become impossible to forget. Someone else may give them attention, affection, even companionship, but nobody can recreate the moment when they made you feel completely seen. Your soulmate looked down. For several seconds, there was no response. Then they whispered a question. Do they still remember me? The psychic did not answer immediately. And that silence frightened them more than any prediction could have. Because the answer was not simple. You may remember them. You may not. You may still care. You may have healed. You may have built an entirely different life inside yourself. And that uncertainty was exactly what your soulmate had failed to understand. They had assumed that because they could return to the memory, you would always remain emotionally available at the same place. But time changes people. Pain changes people. Healing changes people. Silence changes people. And while they were spending 11 sleepless nights trying to understand what they had lost, something was happening inside you too. You were slowly becoming less interested in answers that arrived without action. That shift matters. Because there is a point in every powerful connection when the person who once waited begins to release the need for an explanation. That is when the energy changes. That is when the person who left may suddenly feel the weight of their absence. Not because of magic. Because human beings often recognize value differently once access disappears. And your soulmate was approaching that realization. But there was one thing they still did not know. The psychic had seen something about your future that they had not yet revealed. Something connected to the reason this person entered your life in the first place. Something that would completely change the meaning of those 11 sleepless nights. The psychic looked at your soulmate and said, "There is one thing you have not understood yet." Your soulmate raised their eyes. The psychic continued. "They are not waiting for you anymore." And that sentence hurt more than everything that came before it. Because suddenly, the question was no longer whether they could forget you. The question became whether they had waited too long. And that is where the next revelation begins. They are not waiting for you anymore. Those words remained in the room long after the psychic stopped speaking. Your soulmate had expected reassurance. Instead, they received a warning. For months, perhaps longer, they had secretly believed that whenever they finally decided to return, you would still be standing in the same emotional place. That assumption had protected them. It allowed them to postpone difficult decisions. It made tomorrow feel safe. There would always be another day to explain. Another opportunity to apologize. Another moment to say what should have been said. But suddenly, tomorrow no longer felt guaranteed. The psychic noticed the change in their expression. What makes you think they will still want the person you were before? Your soulmate had nothing to say. That question cut deeper because it demanded something they had avoided for a long time. Growth. Not promises. Not words. Not another emotional conversation followed by the same behavior. Real change. For the first time, they began wondering whether losing you had actually been the consequence of their own choices. That realization can be devastating. Because it is easier to blame timing than to admit fear. It is easier to blame circumstances than acknowledge avoidance. It is easier to say, "It simply was not meant to happen," than to whisper, "I was not ready." Your soulmate had been using the first explanation. The psychic was forcing them toward the second. Then something unexpected happened. The psychic asked them to describe the last time they saw you. Your soulmate began speaking. At first, the details came slowly. Then everything started pouring out. The room. The expression on your face. The things that remained unsaid. The strange feeling that something important was ending. And then they remembered your eyes. Not anger. Not desperation. Something quieter. Acceptance. That was the detail that shook them. Because they had mistaken your silence for weakness. They thought you would continue reaching. They expected another message. Another attempt. Another opportunity for them to delay the inevitable conversation. Instead, you stopped. No dramatic announcement. No final performance. No attempt to make them jealous. You simply became quiet. And that quietness became louder with every passing week. Your soulmate eventually understood that silence was not punishment. It was exhaustion. You had reached the point where explaining your heart repeatedly no longer felt like love. It felt like abandoning yourself. That distinction became impossible for them to ignore. The psychic leaned forward. "You know what they wanted from you?" Your soulmate shook their head. They wanted certainty. Then came the second part. But you gave them uncertainty. The statement sounded harsh. Yet your soulmate knew exactly what it meant. You had offered genuine emotion. They had responded with hesitation. You had opened doors. They had stood outside. You had tried to understand their fears. They had hidden behind them. Eventually, even the strongest connection reaches a point where one person realizes that love cannot be carried by two people when only one is willing to hold it. That was the lesson your soulmate was finally learning. And then the psychic revealed something even more unsettling. You think you are suffering because they left. Your soulmate looked up. You are actually suffering because they stopped chasing you. Silence. That sentence exposed the part nobody had discussed. Your absence had become real. Not temporary. Not dramatic. Real. There was no longer a constant stream of reassurance proving that you still cared. No message appearing unexpectedly. No attempt to reopen the conversation. No emotional reaction for them to interpret. Nothing. And human beings often understand the value of something differently when there is no longer evidence that it remains available. That night, your soulmate went home carrying a completely different question. Not, how do I forget them? But, how do I know whether I still have a chance? That question followed them into the next morning. They checked their phone. Nothing. They opened your old conversation. Nothing new. They looked at your profile. Perhaps there was no obvious sign that you were thinking about them. Life seemed to be moving forward without asking their permission. That frightened them. Because they had spent so much time assuming the story was paused. They did not realize you had continued living. And somewhere along that journey, your heart had begun changing. Not necessarily toward another person. Toward yourself. That is what your soulmate had not anticipated. They imagined that healing meant finding someone new. But healing can look completely different. Sometimes it means waking up one morning and realizing you no longer need an explanation to feel complete. Sometimes it means remembering someone without feeling compelled to contact them. Sometimes it means wishing them well without reopening the door. Sometimes it means understanding that love can be genuine while separation can still be necessary. That realization is powerful. Because it places your future back into your hands. And according to the psychic, that was exactly the shift your soulmate sensed. They could feel that the emotional balance had changed. Once, they had controlled the distance. Now, they no longer knew where they stood. That uncertainty became unbearable. So they asked the psychic another question. If I contact them, will they respond? The psychic did not give the easy answer. Instead, they said, that depends on who contacts them. Your soulmate looked confused. The psychic continued. If the person who hurt them returns, they may protect themselves. If the person who finally understands what they did returns, they may listen. That difference changed the entire meaning of the situation. Because coming back is easy. Becoming different is difficult. Anyone can send a message at midnight. Anyone can say, I miss you. Anyone can apologize when loneliness becomes uncomfortable. But genuine accountability requires something deeper. It requires admitting where you failed. It requires accepting that forgiveness may not be immediate. It requires allowing the other person to have boundaries. And most importantly, it requires accepting that you cannot demand the same place in their heart simply because you finally understand their value. Your soulmate had never considered that possibility. They had been thinking about returning. Now they were thinking about earning the right to be heard. That was a completely different journey. And the psychic still had not revealed the most important part. There was something they had seen surrounding your energy. Something that had nothing to do with whether your soulmate would return. Something connected to why you had survived the emotional confusion in the first place. The psychic asked your soulmate to remember the first time they felt strangely familiar with you. Not attracted. Familiar. That distinction mattered. Your soulmate thought for a moment. Then they described it. They said meeting you felt strangely natural. As though some part of them already knew how to speak to you. As though they did not need to perform. As though conversations could move from ordinary subjects into deeply personal territory without effort. The psychic nodded. Then they said something your soulmate had never considered. That familiarity was not permission to possess them. It was an invitation to grow. Your soulmate became quiet again. Because perhaps they had misunderstood the entire connection. Maybe they had been focused on what they could receive from you. Comfort. Attention. Affection. Understanding. But the deeper purpose may have been what the connection demanded from them. Courage. Honesty. Emotional maturity. Responsibility. And that realization made the 11 nights make sense. They were not losing sleep simply because they missed your presence. They were confronting the person they had become when they were afraid of loving you properly. That version of themselves had finally become impossible to ignore. Then the psychic said, "You keep asking whether they are your destiny." A pause followed. "You should be asking whether you became worthy of the lesson they brought into your life." Those words changed the room again. Your soulmate lowered their head. For the first time, they stopped looking for a prediction. They started looking at themselves. And this is where your story becomes different from the usual soulmate message. Because the answer is not simply, "They are coming back." The real question is whether the person returning would be capable of giving you something healthier than what existed before. That is what matters. A reunion without transformation simply recreates the old wound. A conversation without honesty only postpones another goodbye. An apology without changed behavior becomes another empty promise. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that. And then, during that 11th night, something happened that they had not experienced before. They remembered a moment when you needed them. Not for money. Not for attention. Not for some grand rescue. You needed emotional presence. And they were not there. At the time, they had convinced themselves they had reasons. Now those reasons sounded painfully small. They realized that you had not asked for perfection. You had asked them to show up. They had failed. That memory became the one they could not escape. They wondered how many times you had quietly swallowed disappointment because you loved them. How many moments had passed where you wanted to say something but decided not to create another argument. How many times had you looked at your phone hoping their name would appear? How many nights had you gone to sleep wondering whether they cared? The painful possibility was that while they were now losing sleep over your absence, you had already experienced those sleepless nights long before them. That thought broke something open. For the first time, they understood the cost of their choices from your side. And that is when the psychic said the sentence that frightened them most. You may not be afraid of losing them. Your soulmate looked up. You may be afraid that they have finally learned how to live without you. Those words followed them home. They could not escape them. Because suddenly, every day you remained silent became evidence that you were changing. Not necessarily forgetting. Changing. And there is a difference. Forgetting erases. Healing transforms. Your soulmate began to wonder what version of you existed now. Would you still answer the same way? Would you still forgive so quickly? Would your eyes still soften when you saw them? Would you even want the relationship they once refused to protect? They had no answers. And uncertainty became their greatest punishment. But then came something even more unexpected. The psychic looked at them and said, "There is another person involved." Your soulmate froze. For a moment, they assumed the worst. Someone else had entered your life. Someone had replaced them. Someone was receiving what they once took for granted. But the psychic shook their head. No, then came the clarification. The other person is you. Your soulmate stared at them. The psychic explained that the version of you they remembered was already gone. The person who once tolerated confusion was changing. The person who once waited for explanations was becoming stronger. The person who once measured their worth through another person's response was learning to measure it through their own peace. And that transformation was the real reason your soulmate felt the connection differently now. They were not simply missing the old you. They were sensing that the old dynamic could no longer survive. Something had ended. Something else was beginning. But what? That was the question nobody had answered yet. And hidden beneath everything the psychic had said was one final detail. A detail about a choice your soulmate had already made without telling anyone. A choice connected to the phone they kept picking up and putting down. A choice connected to the message they had typed more than once. A choice connected to the reason they had not slept for 11 nights. Because the message sitting inside their phone was not what you would expect. It did not begin with, "I miss you." It did not say, "Come back." It did not ask for another chance. It began with 4 words. "I finally understand why." And after those 4 words came a confession that could change the entire story. But your soulmate still had not pressed send. Because one final fear remained. What if you had already moved beyond the person they used to be? What if the door was not closed because you hated them? What if it was closed because you finally loved yourself enough to stop standing outside it? That possibility was the one thing they could not sleep through. And before they could make their decision, the psychic revealed why your connection had appeared in their life at all. The answer was not what your soulmate expected. And when they heard it, they finally understood what that mysterious sentence had truly meant. The revelation was waiting for them in the next part. The message remained unsent. 4 words sat on the screen, carrying more weight than an entire conversation. "I finally understand why." Your soulmate read them again. Then again. Their thumb hovered over the screen. But they still could not press send. Because understanding something privately is one thing. Admitting it to the person you hurt is something else entirely. For 11 nights, they had been fighting memories. Now they were fighting themselves. The psychic had already told them that the connection was never meant to be measured only by whether 2 people ended up together. There was a lesson hidden inside it. A lesson your soulmate had avoided for far too long. They had believed love was supposed to feel easy when the right person arrived. You had shown them something different. Real connection can be peaceful and terrifying at the same time. Peaceful because you can finally stop pretending. Terrifying because another person can see the truth you have spent years hiding. That was what happened when they met you. You noticed things they thought nobody noticed. The hesitation behind their confidence. The sadness beneath their jokes. The loneliness hidden beneath a busy life. You did not need them to explain every wound. Somehow, you sensed them. That made them feel safe. Then it made them feel exposed. And exposure triggered the very instinct that eventually pushed them away. They created distance. You felt the change. You tried to understand it. Eventually, you stopped fighting it. What your soulmate never realized was that your withdrawal was not the beginning of your healing. It was the result of everything you had already survived. There had been a point when you finally understood that you could not convince someone to become emotionally available. You could love them. You could forgive them. You could give them time. But you could not do their inner work for them. That realization changed you. And according to the psychic, that was the moment the connection changed direction. Before that point, your energy had been reaching outward. Afterward, it began returning to you. Your attention came back. Your confidence came back. Your peace came back. Your identity came back. You started remembering who you were before their uncertainty became part of your daily thoughts. That transformation was invisible to your soulmate. But something inside them sensed it. That is why their memories became stronger after you became quieter. They were no longer receiving constant emotional confirmation from you. There was no longer a familiar signal telling them that you were still waiting. That absence created a question. And questions are dangerous when someone has spent years avoiding answers. The psychic watched them struggle. Then asked, "Do you know what changed when they stopped chasing you?" Your soulmate remained silent. You lost the version of them that needed your approval. Those words struck hard. Because they had never understood how much power their uncertainty had given them. As long as you waited, they could postpone. As long as you cared openly, they could remain undecided. As long as you kept the emotional door open, they could tell themselves there was no urgency. But healing closed that loophole. Now they had to choose. And choice was exactly what they had feared. Your soulmate looked at the message again. I finally understand why. They added another sentence. Then deleted it. Added another. Deleted that too. They wanted to explain everything. But somewhere inside, they knew a long explanation could become another excuse. So they asked themselves a harder question. What would I say if I could not defend myself? That question produced silence. Then honesty. I was scared. For simple words. No elaborate justification. No blaming timing. No blaming circumstances. Just fear. They admitted that your closeness had forced them to confront parts of themselves they had spent years avoiding. You made them imagine a future where they could no longer hide behind emotional distance. That possibility terrified them. So they chose what felt safer. Distance. Control. Silence. But safety came with a price. They lost access to someone who had made them feel understood. And now they were beginning to understand something else. The person they had once considered emotionally strong because you kept forgiving them had not been weak at all. Your patience had been strength. Your compassion had been strength. Walking away had been strength too. That realization changed the way they remembered you. They stopped remembering only the moments they missed. They began remembering the moments they failed. And regret became heavier. But the psychic still had one final piece of information. There is something about this connection you have misunderstood. Your soulmate looked up. You thought the purpose was to bring this person back to you. The psychic paused. The purpose was to bring you back to yourself. That sentence changed everything. Because suddenly the entire story looked different. Perhaps the connection had not been a punishment. Perhaps it had been a mirror. You reflected qualities your soulmate needed to develop. Emotional honesty. Consistency. Courage. Responsibility. The ability to communicate instead of disappearing. The ability to love without controlling. And perhaps they reflected something back to you as well. They showed you where you were willing to overgive. They showed you how long you could remain patient with uncertainty. They showed you the difference between loving someone and abandoning yourself for them. That is why some connections feel almost impossible to explain. They are not always designed to stay unchanged. Sometimes they arrive to move both people. One person learns how to stop running. The other learns how to stop waiting. And when both lessons are learned, something unexpected can happen. A new chapter becomes possible. But only if both people are different enough to create it. Your soulmate was beginning to understand this. That was why the psychic refused to promise a reunion. A reunion could not be the reward for missing someone. It had to be the result of growth. Your soulmate asked, "Then what happens now?" The psychic answered with a sentence that left them completely still. Now they get to choose. Not you. Not destiny. Not the psychic. You. For perhaps the first time, your soulmate realized that the future was no longer something they could control. They had made their choices. Now you had yours. And that frightened them. Because they remembered how many times you had given them another opening. What if there would be no more? What if the person they once knew had become someone who required consistency? What if apologies were no longer enough? What if you had learned to recognize the difference between words and actions? That was the possibility they could not escape. The psychic then asked them to close their eyes. Imagine seeing them again. Your soulmate did. At first, they imagined the old version of you. The one who smiled when they entered the room. The one who listened carefully. The one who wanted things to work. Then the image changed. They imagined you standing there with the calmness of someone who had survived the uncertainty. You were not angry. You were not begging. You were not trying to convince them. You were simply looking at them. And in that imagined moment, they understood something devastating. They could not charm their way back into your life. They would have to tell the truth. Every truth. Even the uncomfortable ones. The psychic opened their eyes. Do you still want them? Your soulmate hesitated. Then answered, yes. But the psychic immediately asked another question. Do you want them, or do you want the version of yourself you became around them? Your soulmate could not answer. That question went deeper than everything else. Because sometimes we miss a person. Sometimes we miss who we were when we believed in the possibility of that person. Those two feelings can look identical until you examine them closely. Your soulmate sat quietly. Then something shifted. They realized they did not merely miss receiving your love. They missed becoming more honest around you. That was the part they had never understood. You had awakened something. And losing you had not extinguished it. It had forced them to recognize it. For 11 nights, they had been asking why your memory remained so powerful. Now they had the answer. You were connected to a version of themselves they had not yet fully become. That did not guarantee a reunion. It created responsibility. If they wanted another chance, they would have to become the person capable of handling one. That night, they finally pressed send. Not a dramatic paragraph. Not a desperate confession. Not a demand. Just the beginning of accountability. I finally understand why I kept pulling away. The message went through. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then one small notification appeared. Delivered. Your soulmate stared at it. No response. A minute passed. Then 10. Then an hour. Still nothing. And strangely, they felt calmer. Because for the first time, they had done something without trying to control the outcome. They had told the truth. Now the decision belonged to you. That was the moment the psychic's original sentence finally made sense. Your soulmate had not been unable to sleep because you were magically pulling them back. They were unable to sleep because their conscience had finally caught up with their heart. The connection had become a mirror. And they could no longer look away. But there was still something the psychic had not told them. Something about you. Something that would determine whether this message ever became a new beginning or simply the final chapter of an old story. Because while your soulmate had been struggling through 11 nights, you had been experiencing something completely different. You had been receiving signs of your own transformation. Not necessarily supernatural signs. Small changes. A sudden calm where anxiety used to live. A loss of interest in chasing explanations. A stronger desire for peace. A strange feeling that something from the past was approaching, yet no longer had the same power over you. Perhaps you noticed it. Perhaps you did not. But the psychic had seen it. And there was one final detail that made them certain this story was not finished. Your soulmate was not the only person who had changed. You had changed too. That meant any future encounter would not resemble the past. The old dynamic could not survive. The old version of them could not simply walk back into the old version of you. Something had to be different. And the final revelation was hidden inside one sentence the psychic had written down before your soulmate ever arrived. A sentence they had not yet shown anyone. A sentence explaining exactly why this connection had remained unforgettable. When your soulmate finally saw those words, their entire expression changed. Because the psychic had written something that no stranger should have been able to know. And that is the part of the message you need to hear next. Because the sentence was not about your soulmate. It was about you. And once they understood what it meant, they realized the person they had spent 11 nights missing had never actually been the person they thought they lost. The sentence written on that page was only 7 words. They lost you before they understood you. Your soulmate read it once. Then they read it again. Something inside them became completely still. Because those words explained the entire connection without giving them the comfort they wanted. They had spent so much time believing they understood you. They had assumed they knew why you stayed. They had assumed they knew what you felt. They had even assumed they knew how long you would wait. They had been wrong. The psychic continued speaking. You thought their love was the reason they remained. That was only part of it. They remained because they believed the person they loved would eventually choose themselves. Your soulmate stared at the page. The meaning slowly became clear. You had not entered their life merely to become someone they loved. You had entered their life during a period when they needed to confront themselves. And once you had done that, your role changed. You stopped being the person waiting for answers. You became the person who no longer needed them. That was the transformation your soulmate had sensed. And that was why your silence felt different. There was no anger behind it. No attempt to manipulate. No hidden demand. You had simply reached a place where peace mattered more than uncertainty. That kind of change cannot be faked. It shows up in the way someone carries themselves. It appears in the choices they make when nobody is watching. It changes what they tolerate. It changes what they expect. It changes what they consider love. And your soulmate was beginning to realize that if they ever stood in front of you again, they would not be meeting the same person they once left behind. They would be meeting someone who had learned the lesson they themselves had delayed. That realization brought another question. Is it too late? The psychic did not answer immediately. Instead, they said, too late for the old relationship? Perhaps. Too late for the truth? Never. Your soulmate closed their eyes. That distinction mattered. Because maybe the purpose of this connection was never to guarantee an ending. Maybe it was to make both of you incapable of returning to the people you had been before meeting each other. And that is why this message should not be interpreted as a command to sit around waiting. If someone belongs in your future, their actions will eventually make that clear. If they return, let consistency speak. If they apologize, watch what changes afterward. If they say they understand, allow time to prove it. You do not have to become the detective of someone else's intentions. Your responsibility is to protect the peace you fought so hard to recover. That is the part your soulmate never understood about you. They thought your love made you vulnerable. The truth was almost the opposite. Your love gave them access to a version of themselves they had never met. And when they lost that access, they were forced to discover whether they could create that version without you. For 11 nights, they struggled. On the 12th morning, something changed. They woke up without the usual panic. The memory was still there. The longing had not disappeared. But the desperation had. They finally understood that missing you did not give them ownership over your future. If they wanted another opportunity, they would have to approach you with humility. Not expectation. Not entitlement. Not nostalgia. Humility. That was the difference between wanting you back and becoming capable of loving you properly. And then they looked at the message they had sent. Still no response. They expected disappointment. Instead, they felt something unexpected. Respect. For you. For your silence. For the possibility that you might need time. For the fact that you were no longer obligated to make them feel better about their mistakes. That was the first genuine sign of change. Not the message. Not the confession. The ability to wait without demanding. Meanwhile, something inside you had also settled. Perhaps you had already felt that shift. Maybe you had recently noticed that memories no longer carried the same sting. Maybe you could think about the past without wanting to reopen it. Maybe part of you still wondered what would happen if they returned. That is normal. Healing does not require pretending you never cared. It means caring without losing yourself. And there is a powerful difference between those two states. You can love someone and still choose peace. You can remember someone and still move forward. You can forgive without restoring access. You can hope for someone's growth without placing your life on hold. That is the strength this connection was meant to teach you. Then came the moment nobody expected. Your phone lit up. A message. Not from the person you had been thinking about. From someone connected to a chapter of your life you thought was completely finished. You opened it. And the first line made your heart stop for a moment. I don't expect anything from you. That sentence mattered. Because once upon a time, the person on the other side would have expected your immediate response. Now they were finally acknowledging your freedom. The rest of the message was different from what you imagined. There was no pressure. No emotional manipulation. No attempt to make you feel guilty. Just honesty. I know I hurt you. I know saying sorry cannot erase what happened. I also know that I cannot ask you to trust words that I have not supported with actions. Then came the sentence that your soulmate had struggled to write. I don't know what place I have in your life now, but I finally understand that I don't get to decide that anymore. Read that again. Because that is the true turning point. Not when someone misses you. Not when someone dreams about you. Not when someone asks a psychic about you. The turning point comes when they finally understand that your choice matters too. For a long time, the connection had revolved around their fear. Their hesitation. Their timing. Their comfort. Their uncertainty. Now, your boundaries had become part of the equation. And that changed everything. The psychic had been right. The real revelation was never that your soulmate could not forget you. It was that they had finally understood why they could not. You represented a truth they had postponed. You represented the moment they were forced to become honest with themselves. You represented the person they could not keep blaming for the consequences of their own choices. But there is an even deeper truth. You were never supposed to spend your life proving that you deserve to be chosen. That lesson belongs to the past. If this person returns, they must meet you where you are now. Not where you were when they left. And if they cannot, then their role in your life may already have been fulfilled. That is not failure. That is completion. Sometimes the greatest answer arrives when you stop demanding one. Sometimes closure is not another conversation. Sometimes closure is the moment you realize that the person who once had the power to disturb your peace no longer controls it. And perhaps that is why this message found you. Not to make you wait. Not to convince you that someone is secretly suffering. Not to promise a future that nobody can guarantee. It found you because something inside you needed to hear this. Your value was never determined by whether someone recognized it quickly. Their delay did not reduce your worth. Their confusion did not make you less lovable. Their fear did not mean you were too much. Their silence did not mean you were forgotten. And their return, if it ever comes, will not be the proof that you finally became worthy. You were worthy before they understood anything. That is the secret your soulmate discovered too late. The psychic's final words were simple. Do not tell them to wait. Tell them to live. Because if two paths are truly meant to cross again, they will not require one person to destroy their present while waiting for the past. Life will move. People will grow. Circumstances will change. And eventually, truth will have an opportunity to reveal itself. Maybe your soulmate will become brave enough to stand in front of you. Maybe they will finally say everything they once swallowed. Maybe there will be a conversation that neither of you believed would ever happen. Or perhaps their greatest contribution to your life was helping you become someone who no longer needs that conversation. Either way, you win when you choose yourself. And if your heart still feels a strange connection to this message, write, "I choose peace." Not because you are giving up on love. Because you are refusing to abandon yourself for it. There is something sacred about reaching the point where you can say, "I loved you. I wanted it to work. I was hurt. I learned. And now I am moving forward." That is not bitterness. That is maturity. Your soulmate's 11 sleepless nights may have begun with your absence. But they ended with their own reflection. They finally saw the person they had been avoiding. And that person was themselves. The psychic never promised that you would return. The psychic never promised that they would return. The message revealed something far more valuable. The connection had already done its deepest work. It had exposed what needed healing. It had revealed where fear controlled love. It had shown you where patience became self-abandonment. It had forced your soulmate to confront the consequences of emotional avoidance. And now the next chapter belongs to choice. Your choice. Their choice. Not fate forcing either person. Not desperation. Not loneliness. Choice. So if someone from your past has been occupying your thoughts lately, do not immediately assume it means you must go back. Ask yourself something more important. What did that connection teach me about who I am now? The answer may surprise you. Perhaps you discovered that you love deeply. Perhaps you learned that boundaries are not cruelty. Perhaps you realized that forgiveness does not require reconciliation. Perhaps you finally understood that being chosen by another person is beautiful, but choosing yourself is essential. And perhaps, somewhere beyond what you can currently see, another chapter is waiting. Whether that chapter includes this person or someone entirely unexpected, it must be built on the version of you that exists today. Not the version who tolerated uncertainty. Not the version who begged for clarity. Not the version who questioned their own worth. The stronger version. The wiser version. The calmer version. The one who understands that love should never require you to disappear. That is the real revelation. Your soulmate spent 11 nights trying to understand why they could not forget you. Eventually, they discovered the answer. They were never simply remembering you. They were remembering the moment you made them see themselves clearly. And once someone has seen that truth, they cannot unknow it. That is why the psychic sentence stayed with them. That is why the nights became so long. That is why the message was finally sent. And that is why your story does not need to end with someone running back to you. It ends with something much stronger. You standing firmly inside your own life. No chasing. No begging. No proving. No waiting for another person to decide your worth. If they return, let their actions introduce them. If they apologize, let consistency translate the words. If they remain distant, let peace fill the space they left. Either way, the person who began this story is not the person standing at the end of it. You have already crossed the hardest part. And perhaps the most beautiful truth of all is this: the person they could not sleep without remembering is no longer waiting to be remembered. You are already moving forward. And that is exactly why they finally woke up. If this message found you at the right moment, don't leave without claiming your peace. Write, "I choose peace," in the comments as a reminder that you are no longer chasing what is meant to find you. And if you want more messages like this, subscribe and stay connected. The next message may speak directly to the chapter you are entering now.